Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. These are lines from the poem The New Colossus by American poet Emma Lazarus. And these lines are inscribed on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island in New York. The poem imagines the United States as a welcoming symbol of hope and opportunity for immigrants. All immigrants. But since that poem's publication, incidentally, some 142 years ago now, in November of 1883, a lot has changed about immigration to the United States. Some 4 decades or so later, the U.S. Congress would pass the most restrictive immigration legislation in U.S. history, the Immigration Act of 1924. Which brings us to the reason for this discussion. It is an intriguing time in history to be, of all things, American, and even more fascinating to be immigrant American. Even if you're not paying attention, it's difficult not to notice all that's happening with immigrants across the U.S. these days. Part of what's intriguing, though, is that this conversation is not entirely new. There were similar concerns. It was a similarly contentious debate that led to passage of the Immigration Act of 1924, which was actually accompanied by decades of intense legislative battles involving various activist groups, a small group of U.S. legislators, and even U.S. presidents to reform it. 2 other significant pieces of immigration legislation are also credited with helping to shape the current demographic transformation underway in the U.S. today. And those are the Immigration Act of 1952, or the McCarran-Walter Act, and 2, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, or the Hart-Celler Act. While there were other legislative actions, though, in the intervening years between 1924 and 1965, we zoom in on some of the ways these 3 pieces of immigration legislation specifically helped to shape the current immigration climate. And some might argue that the Trump administration's swift policies are designed to help stem that tide. Now, it is important to provide the appropriate context to help us better understand the spirit of the laws. And that proved to be a somewhat detail-rich task. So we broke up the discussion into 2 parts so as not to bore you with details. In the first part, we discussed the 1924 and 1954 immigration laws, and then in the second part, we discussed the 1965 law and the Trump administration's immigration policy priorities. And as President Trump would say, probably, thank you for your attention to this matter. Good. So let's begin by looking at the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, the bill named after the 2 U.S. legislators who sponsored it, namely Representative Albert Johnson. This is a Republican representing Washington District's 3rd Congressional District, and then Republican Senator David Reed of Pennsylvania. Now, last year in 2024 marked the centennial year of this landmark legislation that changed U.S. immigration policy forever. And if you're an immigrant like me, you probably should know that had it not been for a loophole and those subsequent legislative battles, many of us would probably not be in these United States. So hopefully by re-examining some of the circumstances and the debates around passage of these legislations, we may glean some insight and perhaps a more informed lens or a more informed set of lenses through which to address some of the questions that exercise us about the current climate. Now, according to publications from the Office of the Historian in the Foreign Service Institute at the U.S. State Department, the Immigration Act of 1924 instituted a strict set of national origin quotas, and this stemmed the flow of large-scale immigration for decades. Now, before the 1924 law, there were other restrictive changes in U.S. immigration policies, reflected in such measures as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Then there was the General Immigration Act of 1882, or even the Immigration Act of 1917. But none of these measures went as far as the law, the 1924 law, the Johnson-Reed Act. It sharply curtailed immigration for Southern and Eastern European countries, and it banned people from almost all Asian countries. Senator Reid was cited observing that the legislation marked a landmark, a turnaround, a complete turnaround reversal in the nation's history, that we were no longer to be a haven, a refuge for the oppressed. The world over, we found we could not be. We definitely abandoned that theory. America will cease to be the melting pot. End of quote. Now, there were four notable impacts of this legislation. One, it established the national origin quota system. The law, it set numerical limits that created a quota based on the 1890 U.S. Census. It allowed 2% of the total number of people of each nationality who were present in the United States during 1890. And the law reportedly favored immigrants from Northern and Western European countries, such as Germany, Great Britain, and Ireland, and it apparently imposed greater restrictions on countries from Southern and Eastern Europe like Greece, Albania, Turkey. And for example, Germany had the highest quota of over 51,000. Then Great Britain and Northern Ireland had over 34,000. Ireland had over 28,500 immigrants. From these three countries alone, immigrants comprise some 70% of all the visas available, while Greece, Albania, and Turkey, for example, were allowed 100 immigrants per year. And two, the law barred immigration from all of Asia, explicitly barring migrants from countries designated the Asiatic barred zones, which included most of Asia and the Pacific, with some exceptions for Japan and the Philippines. And three, the law instituted the modern U.S. visa system. It capped the total number of immigrants allowed annually at about 165,000, and that was half of the 1920 total. And for the first time, it required all immigrants to receive visas from an American consulate or embassy stationed in their country before they actually left for the United States. It imposed requirements for a more organized visa system to pre-screen immigrants at embassies and consulates. And four, it mandated the establishment of the U.S. Border Patrol. The law required establishment of the Border Patrol under the Labor Appropriations Act of 1924, and this was part of the broader Immigrations Act. Now, the bill officially created the Border Patrol within the Department of Labor. And why the Department of Labor? Because since then, immigration was about the labor market. It was about access, entry to the country's labor force. And even then, though, it was becoming more restrictive. It wasn't until 1940 that the U.S. Border Patrol was moved to Department of Justice and then to Department of Homeland Security in 2003 as part of the creation of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, that is CBP. Now, both Senator Reid and Senator Johnson believed that this was a necessary measure to protect against a stream of alien blood. And it asserted that the racial composition of America at that time be made permanent. They argued that the wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were filthy, un-American, and even dangerous. Yes, these were the tones of the public discourse just weeks before successful passage of the Johnson-Reid Act. The bill passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming support. However, there was a freshman congressional representative, Emanuel Seller, a Democrat, and this is Jewish American representing New York's 10th congressional district, an area that was heavily populated by immigrants. He was the most outspoken and long-standing opponent of the legislation. He would commit to fighting the bill for the next 4 decades or so. And Seller's campaign, though, actually culminated with passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, which eventually eliminated the quotas. But before we get there, in 1924, President Coolidge signed the Immigration Act into law. And then came the Immigration Act of 1952, or the McCarran-Walter Act. Now, in the years following 1924 passage of the Immigration Act, concerns and criticisms mounted about the impact of this law on U.S. foreign policy and the domestic economic impacts in the labor market. It engendered urgent calls for reform. And then there's another notable gentleman from New York, Senator Herbert H. Lehman. He was the most vocal opponent of the bill in the U.S. Senate. He believed that this legislation relegated naturalized Americans to second-class citizenship and gave excessive arbitrary power to immigration officials. Then, there were U.S. presidents from as early as President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman then Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, who all worked to amend this law and its quota system. And then with the Immigration Act of 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, introduced by Senator Patrick McCarran of Nevada, in the House by Representative Francis E. Walter. This was a Democrat representing Pennsylvania's 15th Congressional District. This bill they produced represented the most extensive congressional study on immigration in the nation's history. This was some 5 years of congressional study. And it also had about 4 impacts. It codified and assembled the nation's immigration and naturalization law for the first time. 2, it continued the national origins quota system, but it allowed quotas for all countries, including the newly independent nations, the former colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, ending Asian exclusion from U.S. immigration, right? It awarded thousands of visas to Western and Northern European countries, a few thousands to Eastern and Southern European countries, and then a few hundred to the newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. This removal of the racial requirements, though, still allowed for some 85% of all visas available at the time to go to Northern and Western Europeans. The bill also removed racial restrictions on naturalization, citizenship by naturalization, because until 1952, there were restrictions on citizenship by naturalization in the U.S. Western Hemisphere immigration continued without quotas. Under the Monroe Doctrine, this was an exception, and for historical context, immigration from Latin America and the Caribbean did not pose any significant concern, so there were quota preference systems established which allowed relatives of U.S. citizens already living in the U.S. and immigrants with special skills to be allowed preference, a priority for visas, and this is a policy that is still used today. And then 4, security provisions. The law maintained the quota system in response to national security concerns over what they called criminals and subversives. And this was at a time when there were fears of communist infiltrators from Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. They ran rampant in Congress, the halls of Congress, and it reflected in public opinion as well. But at passage of the 1952 law, President Truman was so concerned about maintaining the quota system that he vetoed the bill. But the law found so much support in Congress that it passed despite his veto. And then came President Eisenhower. When he assumed office in 1953, him and his Secretary of State, John Dulles, they criticized the quota system for being incompatible with our basic American tradition. President Eisenhower believed that the bill did not go far enough to address the ongoing refugee crisis in post-war Europe. So they appealed to Congress to make some amendments in the interest of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. Then Eisenhower was able to sign the 1953 Refugee Relief Act, which allowed over 200,000 refugees and escapees from communist nations in Europe to enter the U.S. outside of the quota system. And in the aftermath of World War II, this was a lifeline to many Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. The act was then amended in the following years to increase immigration and to accommodate refugees and some restricted classes. Then came the Immigration Act of 1965, or the Hart-Celler Act. But let's adjourn the discussion here and resume in the second part as promised. If you find these facts relevant and timely, share this video with someone who may be affected by the dramatic changes unfolding in U.S. immigration policy. If you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow Guyana Tapestry on all social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, TikTok, and stay connected to the diaspora community developments. Thank you so much for your support of the work we're doing. Family, this is Guyana Tapestry. I am Pelham Van Kooten, and we are telling Guyana's immigration story. Until our next story, it's One Love GT.